Hello, good evening. My name is Franklin Mohan, and I've been asked by Poetry and Prose to read one of the short stories in my new book called "Love Has Two Moons" by Franklin Mohan. It can be accessed on Amazon, so it's "Love Has Two Moons," and this one story is called "Bonobo the Beater." And it concerns Mr. Bonobo, who was a teacher notorious for flogging and in um, and giving out corporal punishment for little or no transgression to students in the school. So here we go, Bonobo the Beater. Godi and I got to Mr. Earl Bonobo's office before he did. Bonobo was the dean of discipline, so we sat ourselves down like men on death row, except that we didn't have the luxury of a last meal, a last wish, a last cigarette, or a conjugal visit. We were chairless, we were glum, unable to exchange pleasantries. My heart rate was elevated to a height I hadn't experienced in all my 8 years of going to school. I felt a heightened sense of awareness of what I knew would come sooner rather than later, even though I wished it would be later, much, much later, but I had no say in the matter. Bonobo was taking his time, and was this part of his torture tactic? Part of the entire process of turning us into simpering, cowering idiots who had no recourse but to sit there and take his punishment. In the silence that ensued, I couldn't help thinking of how we had reached this point. My name is Charlie Batt. The schools I attended in Trinidad were founded by Canadian Presbyterian missionaries. However, the administration of these schools conformed to the British system of education. The curricula were all British and bore no similarity to Canadian pedagogics. Corporal punishment was commonplace the world over. The zeitgeist of the 1950s and 60s in British Trinidad, and indeed the world, demanded acceptance of corporal punishment. Thus, direct blame on the Canadian mission cannot, in all fairness, be leveled. When I matured as a senior, I realized that the visual aids in the schools were the chalkboards. The auditory aids were the sound of the straps and whips as they fiercely struck the students' backs, backsides, arms, knuckles, legs, and palms. Every morning, the whole school assembled in an orderly fashion in the courtyard, each student standing at a uniform distance from the others. We were made to present our hands, the dorsal surfaces upward for inspection by the teacher. They inspected us mainly for cleanliness, particularly for trimmed fingernails that should be devoid of dirt. If a student had neglected nail hygiene, then we got a whack on the knuckles with a sharp edge of the wooden ruler. 3 cracks in rapid succession. My friend from a Catholic school had his head conked by the wooden balls which adorned the cords the monks wore around their frocks. His infraction? He slouched at his desk. Teachers were expected to use the rod to impel the student towards attaining knowledge. This was a common practice in schools of all denominations: Presbyterian, Catholic, Hindu, Anglican, and Muslim. But bodily assaults like these further diminish what little motivation I had for learning. I couldn't believe earlier that same morning, me, being one of my teacher's favorite students, had been sent to the hibiscus hedge in the schoolyard to pick 5 or 6 whips, 3/4 of an inch thick stems, 3 feet long, to be used for the day's flogging. But Mr. Harry Belahadid, the teacher, shouted over the din of the class, "Go pick me some whips from the hedge." Our nickname for this teacher was Harry Bella Baldhead. He was prematurely bald. His head shone brightly, even indoors. He used to apply coconut oil onto the scalp as a skin protectant. "Yes, sir," I replied. And with his mention of whip, the class settled down and a nervous quietness prevailed. I gained brownie points by stripping the bark from the entire length of the branch, save for an 8-inch segment at the one end to be used as a handle, which served as a non-slip grip. Perhaps this contributed to my sense of complacency into thinking I was not liable to corporal punishment. Absolute power was enjoyed by all the teachers. Corruption, as in the abuse of the strap, rod, or whip, was so common as to be banal. Some teachers imposed their hold over the students with punitive measures, such as caning and flogging, which were equivalent to disgraceful criminal behavior. Kids were slapped, pushed, caned, beaten, clouted, flogged, thrashed, shaken, pinched, and battered on a daily basis. This was enacted and passed off as discipline by the caregivers. Yet, yes, peccant students may have been guilty of misconduct, but many punitive responses by some teachers were akin to psychopathic behavior, devoid of conscience and reasonable judgment. But a beating teacher was synonymous with a good teacher as far as parents and administration and society were concerned. Even the missionaries appeared to turn a blind eye to this common misconduct. This was abuse that contravened the definition of humanity. It was about this time that God's will was still being served by the notorious residential schools on the First Nations reservations in Canada. I wondered, whatever happened to suffer the little children to come unto me? Some teachers were congenial and confined their chastisement to having a rod or a strap in plain view, and this served as enough of a deterrent because the potential effect of the rods was well known by students from their experiences with the other morally objectionable teachers. The transgressions were not of the caliber that deserved any form of violence. Strapping was not a character building exercise. I couldn't recall any crime committed by a fellow student for which he or she even deserved expulsion. But vicious assaults were utilized all the same. It was grade 7, 1959, I recall. Julia was second from the front of the class. She appeared to be uncomfortable, squirming. She looked at me with a contorted face. I was convinced that she must have been fighting to ease some flatus to freedom without disturbing the flow of the lesson being taught. A fart seemed imminent. She was probably timing the inevitable event to coincide with the teacher's farthest wanderings in the classroom. He was given to pacing while lecturing. After struggling to make her anal muscles resist and not giving in to the stampede of gas from within the colon, she let loose a high-pitched, prolonged squeaker, like a balloon deflating, the lips stretched to maximum. The sound followed a sinusoidal waveform like that of a creaking door slowly being opened in a quiet country church. She almost pulled it off because the sound was of such a high frequency that some would claim that it was only heard by females and dogs, as they hear high frequency sounds more perceptibly than men. If it hadn't been for the absolute quiet of the classroom, the musical tone would have been almost undetectable. Thankfully, there wasn't an olfactory consequence. The rest of the class were robbed of laughter as a release of tension because the teacher, Mr. Dixit, actually pronounced Dixit, was one of those bad ones, a beater. No one dared acknowledge this colonic transgression by snickering. "Who did that?" demanded Dixit. He knew all along the cantata came from Julia. He slowly removed his wristwatch from his beating arm, telegraphing what's to come. He whacked Julia 2 lashes over her back with his green hibiscus rod to impart to her a deterrence for future biological inevitabilities. She twitched in pain with each stroke. I looked over and I saw that her eyes were filled with tears, tears that never fell. Humans pass gas an average of about 27 times a day, a factoid I had read somewhere. When I boasted about what I read, Gordy, my buddy, asked whether a prolonged fart constituted one or more of the 27. I was stumped. The kids at this school had empirically classified farts into 6 types: a fuzz, a fizzy fuzz, a poop, an anti-poop, a squeaker, and a rattler. Well, all punitive measures were designed not only to inflict pain, but also to mock and transform the recipient into a laughingstock. In grade 1, I was made to jump with my hands in the air in front of the class for talking out of turn. My short pants were held up only by a stretched and worn elastic band around the waist. They were khaki with shallow pockets that had a print of a cowboy roping a cow with the words "Hopalong Cassidy" under the image. The type of pants appropriate for age 6. Only the older boys of grade 7 wore pants held up with belts, and they didn't have Hopalong Cassidy on their pockets. When I jumped, the pants began an embarrassing descent towards my thighs. Reflexively, I grabbed at the elastic band to avoid the laughter from the rest of the class. Had I allowed my pants to drop further down, an embarrassing exposure followed. The teacher threatened me with whipping if my hands came down, though. So I had to keep them up in the air above my head. The students laughed nervously, roistering in schadenfreude, because it wasn't one of them jumping. My chagrin pleased the teacher, the purveyor of this state of dishonor. Terror through corporal punishment in elementary school was the mother of my inventiveness. Somewhat frequently, I wore 3 pairs of pants to school in the sweltering tropical heat. 3 pairs of pants would, I hoped, would cushion the blows to my backside. Alternatively, I painstakingly made grids with twigs which would fit inside my back pocket. The rationale was that the grid might absorb the sting of the blows. Left-handedness was a taboo, inexplicable, and not acknowledged in a positive way. Had religion misconstrued some scripture and suggested that left-handedness represented the dark and the devil? Sinistrality suggests demon-like. The educational system of the day saw left-handedness as insinuating unholiness and immorality. I learned that famous people who were left-handed included Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, Fidel Castro, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Charlie Chaplin, and Marilyn Monroe. But this mattered not to the teachers. Marilyn, being left-handed, I was struck on the knuckles with the edge of a ruler if I was caught writing with my left hand. The zeitgeist that existed then regarding physical punishment still existed when I entered grade 9, where I developed an interest in evolutionary biology and read that zoologists and psychologists specializing in human-animal behavior suggested that spanking and beating someone else is a manifestation of sexual mounting. It was ironic that the dean of discipline in this high school I later attended, with a name like Mr. Bonobo, conformed as such in keeping with the bonobo apes because of his ferment to inflict pain on students. This was his manifestation of mounting behavior, a desire for domination. Seamus Bat, my dad, was relatively poor, even though he was the principal, the headmaster of the Canadian Mission Primary School that I attended. The majority of pupils were barefooted, and only a few students from wealthier families wore shoes. I might have denied that I was given preferential treatment, but I did get away with various infractions that breached convention and social etiquette. My focus was to make people laugh, to be a practical joker, the class clown. I got into trouble for referring to a girl's mons pubis as what lay distal to that as a triangle. The teacher's threat of reporting this coinage to the principal was enough to cause me to get down on my knees and beg for mercy. I promise never to say it again. This school accommodated 500 boys and girls from grade 1 to grade 7. 2-foot wide aisles between the desks separated one class from the other, and the principal sat on an elevated stage 3 feet higher than the rest of the school. From this perch, he watched over the performance of all the teachers and the students. At times, his vigilant scrutiny made him appear to be a vulture on a telephone wire, looking for carrion. He rang a handheld bell loudly whenever the clatter of 500 voices got out of control. The cacophonous din of excitable kids invariably reached a crescendo. This resulted in heads, that's short for headmaster, aggressively ringing the bell, which was followed by a stern reprimand directed at the whole school and to the subordinate teachers as well. The ensuing quiet was both deafening and uncanny. The proverbial pin could have dropped for everyone to hear. Gradually, over a long period, the cycle of noise insidiously climaxed like Ravel's Bolero, only to be rudely cut short by the bell once more. Just after one such reprimand by Seamus, a boy nicknamed Snotnose was overheard by all. He said, "Heads talking shit." He said that just as the absolute silence was achieved, his timing was off that day. This blunder of Snotnose resulted in 4 lashes with the strap in front of the 500 students. It was at least 15 minutes after that strapping when the noise cycle resumed, as though the menace of the strap was fully forgotten. Like associates with like, birds of a feather, if you will. The niche of class clown was filled by a gang of impish boys and one girl. I was the ringleader. They all had nicknames malignantly bestowed based on some socially embarrassing trait. The recipient grew to accept this name. Sam Simangal suffered from a fistula from a tear duct through the right nasal bone, and there was a constant eruption of spheres of brilliant yellow mucus sitting precariously on the skin over his right nasal bridge. It was a ball of shiny discharge that never ran or rolled off, ensured by the intermolecular forces at the surface of the ball. It seemed that this mucinous sphere mimicked a coffee drop on a mug's rim. He was therefore tagged Snot Nose. Hog's Ass suffered from a bath only if she was caught in a downpour walking on her way to school. She was actually very pretty, but soap was her kryptonite. She changed her underwear after 4 consecutive days, rotating the fabric front one day, back the other, inside the next, and outside on the 4th day. She appeared to be the quintessential flibber tigabet. Swell battled a weight problem throughout his life. He was 350 pounds of mostly fat at age 13. He feared no one. He just threatened to sit on a potential adversary and they'd back down. Egg Sucker could fit a whole chicken egg in his mouth without breaking the shell. Jones Rajpal from Debe, nicknamed Godi, was noted for his genital precocity. Godi in the Trinidad vernacular refers to hernia. He had an obvious bulge in his pants, a gonadal mass with a leftward hang. His pants, hand-me-downs, were long overdue to be replaced. He wore grade 1 pants and grade 4. The white linen pockets hung well below the hemline. This gonadal mass was ever so skillfully tucked away and monitored so that it never made an accidental appearance, though Godi never wore undershorts. My nickname, White Man, resulted from my skin color. I was a very dark Indian. Students teased me that I was born 2 minutes past midnight. My skin was, in fact, just shy of navy blue. They called me White Man because the kids heard my mom admonishing me, "Charlie, come out of the sun, boy. You got turned black." Snot Nose, Swell, Hog's Ass, Egg Sucker, Godi, and White Man were inseparable. A gang, if you like. We got into trouble together and we were flogged together. In spite of my poor showing in exams, I was always the one to whom the others came for help in their studies. They were all straight A students. I developed an ability to explain the concepts to them in very simple terms. I just couldn't, though, perform successfully in an exam with pen and paper. Accordingly, I was a straight F student. The year was 1962. I had left elementary school and was in a private for-profit high school, St. Assisi. It was a large home renovated to serve as a school. So Mr. Earl Bonobo came from the island of Antigua, and he grew up within the privileged class of the Antiguan whites. He never smiled. He was well-muscled and tended to perspire profusely. His trademark was a white starched shirt with a red tie. The necktie was so tightly tied that it caused his jugular veins to bulge and distend. He wore incongruous attire, as there was no air conditioning in this tropical environment. He had a persistent brown ring on the part of his collar that was in contact with his ever sweaty neck. The brown stain diffused, taking up the whole color by the time Friday rolled around. The white shirt was worn all the time. The day of the week could be established by the level of migration of dirt on his collar. The dirty brown residue journeyed down the collar like a chromatogram. Poor dental hygiene had caused bad breath, a stench, almost as destructive to those in proximity as was his whip. His gums encroached onto the base of his teeth, and he had hypertrophy from years of dental neglect, resulting in an ugly ring of fresh blood along his gum lines. Mr. Bonobo was notorious for his disciplinary options, which for him was limited to flogging, although he had had a degree in adolescent psychology. He ignored scientifically published and peer-reviewed methods of handling misdoings by students, by means other than corporal punishment. He exercised flagellation of such pitiless proportions that it bordered on the legal definition of assault. Our grade 9 teacher, Mr. Ramphal, was writing on the chalkboard with his back to the class. He turned around just in time to catch Godi and me chatting and laughing about a joke we had heard. The joke was about Mr. Ramphal's nickname, Stout, because he was so skinny, he appeared to be a cardboard cutout when he stood sideways. He was doubly annoyed because we were supposed to be working on a problem he had assigned. But, Ratball, you think this geometry class is funny? You're both 14 and you should be acting more maturely as grade 9 students. Sorry, sir, Godi said. We're discussing the problem. Stout fired back. What's so funny about quadratic equation? Look, both of you, get up on the bench. Although Godi and I had separate desks, we sat on a common bench, wide enough to accommodate two of us. Having a student stand on his seat, towering above the rest of the class, was a form of humiliation that was as effective a punishment as any alternative, barring a physical flogging. The tropical heat dictated an open classroom. The windows and doorways were open to capture a cooling cross breeze. Just as we got up on the bench, Mr. Bonobo happened by on the outside corridor and spotted us through the open door. Why are these boys on the seats? He said. Mr. Ramphal, who seemed reluctant to have the punishment progress beyond what he had already inflicted, tried to minimize the infraction. They were just talking in class, nothing beyond that. Mr. Ramphal knew what depravity would take place if he relinquished control of our penance to Mr. Bonobo. They're good, so man. They learned their lesson already. They had enough shame for the day, man. Bonobo, who wasn't impressed, replied in a slow guttural drawl. These boys are old enough to know better, man. Only a good set of lash go do the trick. Send them up to my office. Godi and I slowly got off the bench and proceeded upstairs to Mr. Bonobo's office. This was not a comedic interlude. The mood was gloomy and somber. Our fellow students' faces were contorted in empathy, the teacher's face in both empathy and guilt. Mr. Ramphal felt guilty because he assumed responsibility for Godi and me being caught on the bench by Mr. Bonobo. I was sure Mr. Ramphal had not meant for his punishment to evolve into what might turn out based on Bonobo's reputation, a flogging so ferocious and depraved it would be analogous to bestiality. The office of the Dean of Discipline was on the second floor of the school, a quiet part of the building. Next to this office was the senior girls' class. There were 25 nubile, luscious females among 200 testosterone-driven factories in this mainly for-profit boys' high school, and the girls were there to be coached for the finals, the external exams for the General Certificate of Education through the University of London in England. Without exception, all these girls appeared beautiful, attractive, and bewitching. Any girl would have been considered a knockout. Ugly was not in the boys' vocabulary. The girls' faces were the last area on which the boys riveted their eyes. They took in legs, ankles, breasts, cleavage, backsides, and of course, triangles. Makeup, faces, postular acne, deportment, figures, plump or skinny, personality, clothes, poor dental hygiene, and body odor were irrelevant. The chaos that defined adolescent lust dominated our behavior whenever we found ourselves in the presence of these rarities on campus, We all acted virile as if a girl was passing by. We rushed to pick up a fallen pencil or a book, just to be able to hand the item back to these maidens whenever they appeared to be in the slightest distress. We were impregnated with lust, and we were wishfully perceived erotic reactions if one of these females were even to look our way. Fat boys sucked in their bellies while puffing out their chests, and short ones stood on tiptoes as a girl passed by. Godi risked accidental exposure from within his outdated short pants. His gonadal mass challenged his decorum, and whenever the girls were on parade, he spent more time tucking himself in than oogling them. Well, this class of girls was located just next to Mr. Bonobo's burrow, which he called an office. Because of this proximity, the girls were privy to all who were processed in the dean's lair. The door to the girls' classroom was always open to allow the breeze to pass through due to reflected heat from the galvanized iron roof. Mr. Bonobo entered the room without acknowledging our presence, heading over to the open window in the back wall of the room to take a look at nothing in particular. Perhaps it was a delaying tactic designed to intimidate the condemned. He went to the top drawer and produced a freshly harvested hibiscus rod, green, limber, 3/4 of an inch thick, and 3.5 foot long, with the bark still covering the entire length, like the scaly tail of a reptile. There was no eye contact between Godi and me, or between us and Bonobo, who slowly caressed the whip with a lascivious half grin that wasn't a genuine grin, but more like Mona Lisa's. His grin belonged to that of an obdurate ogre. Bonobo demanded no defense. He requested no explanation of how we came to be standing on the bench. It was then that he lined the length of the rod with a thick layer of white chalk. He rubbed the chalk back and forth rhythmically, as if masturbating, slowly at first and then climaxing with a rapid push-pull application of the white coating. The chalk caked layers on the whip like Onan's seed. He appeared to be pleased with the end result. A satisfied smile ripened on his face, a grin that used up the muscles on the left side of his mouth. It was as though he was undergoing the private pleasure of releasing pent-up flatus. I was mesmerized by this simidimi. As I watched him ritualize the process, I forgot for the moment the reason we were there. It was meant to intimidate. Tears began to well up in my eyes as anxiety took hold of my autonomic nervous system. Intestinal movements was aggravated and loud gurgling sounds from my abdomen, borborygmi, temporarily diverted my attention. Bonobo looked at me first. He looked at me for the first time since he entered the room. His gaze was cold. It pierced my body through and through like a rapier. He mentioned to me, with his right index finger of the same hand that held the rod. That finger was temporarily freed while he held the rod upright. The other fingers curled tightly around the shaft. I was automatically drawn to and focused on that finger, which wiggled back and forth, demanding of me to get up and advance towards its owner. The finger dictated to me while I languished in a state of fugue. When the finger pointed up, I looked up. When the finger pointed down, my gaze shifted downward. It seemed at that moment the finger's movement had hypnotized me. The finger was the master, and Bonobo merely its henchman. The finger appeared to be a separate entity from the body to which it was attached. and it seemed more powerful than Bonobo himself. The direction of the wiggling finger then changed. It pointed to where I was to stand, and it continued to wiggle, like the tail of a murderous rattlesnake. I immediately felt a cold flush from my head to toe that was out of place in this hot tropical room. I was now sweating more than Bonobo. Mr. Bonobo drew closer, and with each step, my sense of terror escalated. My skin morphed into goosebumps, piloerection. Anxiety begat floods of adrenaline that coursed through my arteries, leading to a cold sweat. Out of the blue and incongruously, in the throes of anxiety, it occurred to me, piloerection was better than no erection. As suddenly as a strike of a cobra, Bonobo grabbed hold of my pants on one side. To secure a firm grip, he slipped his fingers into my pocket and he stretched the car key over the skin of my backside so tautly that my skin and the fabric almost became one. A skillful surgeon's dissection with scissors and forceps might not have been so successful in separating the fabric from my skin. My hand reflexively careened to the rescue of my backside, as if my outward-facing palm was invincible armor. Bonobo broke the silence. "Move your hand." I complied momentarily, but in a flash, my hand found its way back when Bonobo raised the rod for the first strike. "Move your hand." And then much louder, "I say, move your hand." The dean of discipline, the doyen of the furrows of corporal punishment, was on his tiptoes, hand raised, his rod flexed back over his head. He was ready for the downswing in a plane that would maximize the speed of the rod at its nadir at my backside. He clearly intended to inflict maximum pain and suffering. He was ready to administer 3 strokes on my bottom. Reflexively, my hand gravitated over my buttocks for protection, an instinctive reaction of self-preservation. My gluteal skin was tingling with anticipatory anxiety. "I say, move your hand, we." His threatening manner, and especially the "we," implied dire consequences. By this time, the sound of the commotion had carried down the hall. The altercation drew absolute silence from all classes, especially from the girls' room. It was a nervous silence, begetting empathy. Mr. Bonobo started his attack by raising his arm vertically. He enhanced the height of the arm, ending his backswing above his head. By elevating his body on his tiptoes, he gnashed his teeth and squinted. He transferred his weight to his leading foot and flexed his wrist to increase the speed at the end of the rod. All the while, he maintained his focus on the exact spot he was aiming for on my backside. He held his breath and delivered the first stroke. It cascaded from its zenith like the blade of a guillotine. The first blow landed with such powerful force, it caused an explosion of burning, tingling, and pain with accompanying numbness. My body jerked with the shock of the impact. A bead of sweat began to form on my temples. The bead snaked its way down to my jaw, flowing irregularly as more sweat came from above and pushed the trailing edge of the bead ahead. Paresthesia radiated from the point of impact in waves to the rest of my body, like rapid ripples in a pond. I immediately felt weak and limp, but Bonobo held me up with his firm grip he had secured through his hand in my pocket. The sound of the impact was crisp. I was unable to swallow. There was nothing to swallow as adrenaline made my mouth dry. Neither fight nor flight was possible. Up until then, I had never experienced an assault of such brutality. I was convinced that Bonobo was Lucifer and that this was hell. This strike left a distinct tattoo of chalk 8 inches long on the taut fabric on my pants. Sympathetic shouts of oh God, emanated from the girls next door. Even in my confused, disturbed mind, I realized the reason why he had chalked the whip. He intended to aim for the same chalk mark, the same spot for subsequent strokes. By administering 3 strokes on the same spot, Bonobo intended to break and macerate the skin, not just to cause pain. He engineered the triple impact to prolong pain long after his victims left the office. At this point of the assault, I was oblivious to the outside world, possibly catatonic. My affect was blunted and my body was deadened to pain. However, I could still recall the strokes as separate events because no state of catatonia or numbness could mask such wretchedness. Bonobo's skill, honed from years of practice, left a single thick chalk mark 8 inches long, each of the 3 layers of chalk caked onto my pants like successive layers in shale. At the end of it, Mr. Bonobo had to help me back to my chair as I was limp as the clock in Salvador Dali's painting, The Persistence of Memory. When he was finished, Bonobo gave us permission to leave. He had a look of complete satisfaction, almost orgasmic, as he recovered his bearing and presence of mind. We left the office while Bonobo unrolled his sleeves, buttoning the cuffs and rearranging his shirt tail neatly into his pants. Godi and I had to walk a gauntlet through an unusual spot. We had to pass by the open door of the girls' classroom. 25 pairs of eyes caressed our faces in sympathy as we marched past. A funny thing that testosterone, because in the heat of it all, we found it necessary to put on a macho facade, both of us wearing broad smiles as we walked past by the girls' room. Our expressions hinted that what they had heard was no big deal. Nevertheless, we both had long streams of tears, recent and old, staining both sides of our cheeks. My first thought was of reprisal, and I repeated in my mind, monkey say cool breeze. The expression means you just wait and see. Beware, I'll get you, Bonobo. But these were just fighting words. There were no reprisals possible. Godi shed tears, like me, both before and after his punishment. When I described the impact that Bonobo's whipping had on me, Godi, pretending to be a toughie, admonished me with a machismo. Boy, is them small lash you crying about? We headed for the washroom to look at the damage to both to our pants and to our gluteal skin. My pants still stuck to my skin at the point of impact. I had to peel off the fabric ever so slowly. I was not surprised to see a welt filled with blood-stained fluid, a blister 8 inches long and a half an inch wide. It was raised half an inch above the surrounding skin. My initial impulse was to break the membrane, but I didn't, as it would have stained my pants. I surmised that if my parents ever found out about what had happened, I might have been in further trouble and I'd secure a second licking. It was the accepted rule that the teacher had absolute discretion, and any punishment inflicted was punishment well deserved. I limped home and headed for Mr. Powell, who was the pharmacist in the drugstore downstairs of our house, located on a busy street in town. The rent earned from the downstairs space was a significant compliment to my dad's meager income in those days. Mr. Utan Powell was a kind-hearted gentleman from the island of Carriacou, off Grenada, someone who treated me as his son. When I told him what had happened and he had finished examining the injury, Powell flew into a rage. He was beside himself with disgust. Wait, that man had to do that for, man. Who he think he is, the mother ass? If I could see him now, I'd go bust a cuff on his tail. This man is a son of a bitch. Man, look at what he do to the child. He mumbled while he tended to my wound. This display of empathy did somewhat ameliorate my suffering, and my mood improved to a level where I felt that I could now face my parents without giving away my secret. Mr. Powell sensed my reluctance to report this atrocity to my parents. Boy, he said, you should get your parents involved. Tell them what happened. What? I said. If they find out, I'll be in for another licking. Please, Mr. Powell, don't you tell them anything either. Well, okay, he said in a sing-song cadence. But I'll tell you now, it's against my better judgment. If I had a child so abused, I would want to know. I respected him for complying with my wishes. I attended the dispensary every day for 10 days to get my dressing changed. Every time I went there for a change, or whenever I visited the dispensary, Mr. Powell urged me to let my parents know what Bonobo had done to me. 20 years later, I was visiting my retired parents in New York. The discussion of corporal punishment came up around the dinner table. My father, Seamus Bat, the retired headmaster, used to keep a strap in his desk. I never knew that he was adamantly against corporal punishment, even back in his teaching days. Imbued with maturity, I was surprised to learn that my dad's philosophy. Seamus revealed that he used to pretend he would strap the kids because it was expected of him by the politically motivated Parent-Teachers Association. He used to administer sham hits with a strap. Indeed, I recalled him not hitting me and the other students. Instead, he'd create a commotion by stamping his feet and pretending to go for his belt, which was enough of an alarm. The students improved their compliance. At the dinner table, I related my experience about Mr. Bonobo. My parents listened intently, as the story progressed, and they stopped chewing, swallowed their last mouthfuls, and leaned forward with concern. I included all the details. At one point, I happened to make eye contact with both of them, and as I ended the anecdote, I was taken aback to see them in tears. My mother pushed away her food and lost her appetite. My father's head was bowed. He supported his head with his palms cupped over his face and forehead, his elbows on the table. Only a bald spot on my father's head could be seen from where I sat across the table. Tears spawned anger. They reacted as if the incident had occurred only yesterday. They demanded to know more. They were disappointed that Mr. Powell supported my request for concealment of the facts. It was only then that I realized that they wouldn't have punished me and that they read a certain depravity in Mr. Bonobo's comportment. For me, though, it was an incident long past. But my parents were hearing about it for the first time, and they were living it in the present tense. So that's my story about Bonobo the Beater.